I remember one time, after about 17 or 18 shows, I really wanted to get out of the show.
They smiled for every camera. They shook hands at every premiere, laughed together in promotional photos, and showed up week after week to play the most beloved family in the history of American television. But the moment the director called cut, something else entirely took over. Grudges that never quite healed, ambitions that refused to stay contained, principles that cost real money and real opportunities. For 14 years, Bonanza sold America the image of the perfect frontier family, a father and his 3 sons standing tall against everything the West could throw at them. What the audience never saw was the other story, the one playing out in whispered arguments on studio lots, in boardrooms where careers hung by a thread, in the private grief of men who knew their world was about to change forever. This is that story, and once you know it, the Ponderosa will never look quite the same again. Bonanza premiered in 1959 on NBC, and almost nobody connected to it expected it to last. Westerns were flooding American television in those years, and most of them vanished without leaving much behind. What nobody anticipated was how thoroughly the Cartwright family would burrow into the American imagination, pulling audiences that numbered in the tens of millions every single Sunday night. What they saw felt wholesome, timeless, and somehow like a version of America they desperately wanted to believe in. The distance between that carefully constructed image and what was actually happening behind it turned out to be wider than anyone outside the production ever fully understood. Michael Landon landed on the Bonanza set as the youngest cast member, playing Little Joe Cartwright with a restless energy that caught audience attention almost immediately. What separated Landon from the beginning was that he never came to Hollywood simply to recite lines and collect a paycheck. From almost his first days on set, he studied the writers, watched the directors, and absorbed the mechanics of production with an intensity that some colleagues found quietly unsettling, because he wasn't just learning his role, he was learning everyone else's role too, and that's when the friction started. Producers dismissed his early creative pitches with polite condescension, but Landon refused to accept that arrangement, and kept pushing until the 3rd season, when he was finally handed the opportunity to write an episode. The result surprised nearly everyone except Landon himself, and that one successful episode cracked the door open on everything that followed. He moved from writing into directing, from directing into shaping overall story direction, accumulating creative authority with each passing season. Those battles were the education that made Little House on the Prairie possible, the place where he would eventually hold total creative control, and none of it would have happened without the years of quiet, relentless fighting he did first inside a system that preferred its actors silent and cooperative. Dan Blocker carried something into every scene he filmed that no script could have provided, a warmth that seemed to travel directly through the screen into the living rooms of people who had never met him and never would, but who felt, with complete conviction, that they somehow knew him. Hoss Cartwright became one of the most beloved characters in television history, not because the writing was always exceptional, but because Blocker made him entirely real, and he fought constantly to keep him that way. Scripts that reduced Hoss to physical comedy and frontier muscle got pushed back against, with Blocker insisting the character carry genuine emotional depth and moments of actual tenderness. But the most significant fights Blocker waged were not with the writers at all. During the years when Bonanza ranked among the most popular programs on American television, the show sent its cast on promotional tours across the American South, events that mattered financially to the network. The problem was that many of those venues operated under segregation, and Blocker would not perform in front of a segregated audience. Full stop, no negotiation. He simply told the producers where he stood and held that line as the financial consequences mounted and promotional opportunities evaporated. He went further still, persuading the producers to pull Bonanza from syndication entirely in markets where segregation remained active practice, making it one of the first television programs in American history to take that position. Most stars of that period kept their convictions carefully private, understanding that controversy damaged ratings and shortened careers. Blocker understood all of that and chose his principles anyway, and the quiet courage of what he did has been largely overlooked in the decades since. Pernell Roberts arrived carrying a theater background that made him almost constitutionally unsuited for the compromises that weekly network television demanded. As Adam Cartwright, the eldest and most cerebral of Ben's sons, he brought exactly the gravity the character required. The problem, compounding every single week, was that Roberts could never make peace with what he saw as the show's fundamental limitations. More complex storylines, female characters written as full human beings rather than plot devices, honest engagement with questions of race and representation, these were the things he pushed for repeatedly in rooms where the producers had no real interest in hearing them. 6 seasons of that cycle built something in Roberts that eventually had no outlet except departure. And in 1965, he walked away from one of the most successful programs on American television. What nobody expected was what came next. Rather than stumble, Bonanza thrived after Roberts left, the focus shifting toward Hoss and Little Joe while the ratings climbed and the show ran for nearly another decade without him. Roberts spent years in theater and smaller productions chasing the artistic seriousness he'd always been after, and the painful irony was impossible to miss. He was right about almost everything, and he paid a steep professional price for being right too early and too directly in a room that wasn't ready to hear it. Lorne Green built the Ben Cartwright that audiences accepted as a timeless patriarch on the strength of one of television's most quietly effective illusions. He seemed older than his sons, wiser, more settled, carrying the weight of long experience in every measured word and unhurried gesture. What almost no one watching ever calculated was that Green was only 13 years older than Pernell Roberts and just 18 years older than Dan Blocker, gaps that in ordinary life separated colleagues rather than fathers and sons. Prematurely, silver hair helped. A deep, authoritative voice helped more. But what truly sold the illusion was a quality of absolute stillness that Green carried in his body, a settled gravity that convinced audiences completely, season after season. That's what made 1964 such a genuine surprise. At the exact peak of Bonanza's popularity, Green released a spoken-word country record called Ringo, a ballad about a drifting outlaw delivered in that unmistakable voice, and it climbed all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The stern patriarch of the Ponderosa turned out to be a recording artist capable of reaching the very top of the American music charts. The physical demands Blocker absorbed throughout the production have never received the honest accounting they deserve. Every piece of clothing he wore required custom construction, with stretch panels built into his pants so that fight choreography and horseback sequences could be filmed without restriction. Nevada summer heat during outdoor shoots posed genuine risks for a man of his size, and the crew built specific protocols around managing his comfort between takes, portable cooling fans, reinforced supports sewn invisibly into his costume, careful watching for signs of overheating during the longest days. The gentleness that made Hoss Cartwright so enduring wasn't entirely a performance, and it extended to the way Blocker absorbed the physical difficulty of his work without burdening the people around him with the full reality of what sustaining that character cost him every single day. When Blocker died in May of 1972, following complications from what should have been routine gallbladder surgery, the shock that moved through the cast and crew carried a weight unlike anything they had experienced together across 14 years. He was 43 years old and irreplaceable. The producers faced a creative problem with no clean solution. Hoss couldn't be quietly written out, couldn't be replaced by another actor, couldn't be handed an off-screen exit that let the story continue as though nothing real had been lost. What they arrived at was something Bonanza had never done across all its seasons. They let the grief exist on screen without explanation. The 14th season opened with the Cartwright family visibly mourning, and the cause of Haas's death was never spelled out in dialogue. That unspoken void became the most honest moment the show ever produced, and the series ran one final season before ending in 1973, unable to outlast the loss of the man who had been at its center from the beginning. A fire broke out on the Paramount lot in the late 1960s and swept toward the Virginia City facades with a speed that gave the crew very little time to respond. Sets that had taken years to build were suddenly at genuine risk of being consumed entirely. Frantic efforts by firefighters and crew members preserved the core of what had been constructed, though not without damage and not without significant disruption to the production schedule. Scripts had to be rewritten, timelines shifted, and for a brief and genuinely frightening stretch, the show's future felt uncertain in a way it never had before. None of it was ever widely discussed publicly, kept quietly behind the curtain while the Ponderosa remained intact for the audience on the other side of it. Landon's gift for mischief was documented just as thoroughly among people who worked alongside him as his talent for performance. Long days on a weekly production schedule created a particular kind of accumulated pressure, and his instinctive response was to release it through humor, often at someone else's immediate expense. Crew members learned to approach their equipment with wariness. The story of the co-star who found his boots filled with jelly became a set legend, told and retold in the years after the show ended. The same enormous, restless energy that drove the pranks was the exact same force driving everything else he did, and the man who filled his co-star's boots with jelly was the same man who systematically taught himself the entire craft of television production from the inside out, one unauthorized creative ambition at a time. What Bonanza ultimately gave its audience was something rarer than a Western adventure series. Blocker brought gentleness to an enormous frame and turned Haas Cartwright into an enduring portrait of quiet human strength. Landon brought ferocious ambition to little Joe and transformed a charming youngest son into a fully realized and complex person. Roberts brought a restless conscience to Adam Cartwright and challenged the show, again and again, to become more than it was willing to become. And Green brought a gravity to Ben Cartwright that gave the entire enterprise its moral and emotional weight. The Ponderosa they built together was fictional. The work, the struggle, and the passion they poured into building it were absolutely real, and the story of what it cost them is, in nearly every way that matters, more worth telling than anything that ever aired on a Sunday night.